Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello, and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Well, kind of an interesting mix of topics. In the first hour, we're going to be speaking about Velikovsky and his work regarding ancient catastrophes. And in the second hour, we're going to be speaking with Michael Jower and Mark Marcosi about personal boundaries and your health. Well, I guess you could have some catastrophes in your personal boundaries and health, so maybe we can relate it that way. Not quite sure. Before I bring Laird on to talk about Velikovsky, let me just remind you that Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com, where you can find out about the services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, intuitive counseling, and energy medicine sessions. So please do go to SoulHealer.com, drop me a note, set up a time for a session, and achieve health, healing, and wholeness in your life. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. And don't forget, you can check out all of our archives at the Just Energy Radio website, www.justenergyradio.com, as well as sign up for our newsletter where you can be kept informed of some of the great programming we have coming up in the months to come. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Laird Scranton and get him on the air because I think this is going to be a pretty interesting yet controversial topic. Laird Scranton is an independent software designer from Albany, New York. His degree in English from Vassar College. He has lectured at Colgate University on 2 occasions to classes studying his books. He was invited to write 3 articles for Temple University's upcoming Encyclopedia of African Religion and has published articles on Dogon cosmology in April 2007 edition of Anthropology News, an academic journal by the University of Chicago. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio his new book, The Velikovsky Heresies. Laird Scranton. Oh, mute button. Hey, Laird.
Hey, Dr. Rita. How are you?
You know those important things. Wait, I can't hear you, Laird.
Yes. Well, thank you for inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for coming back on. So I think it's interesting because your other 2 topics have been the Dogon and, myth and symbol. And so this seems like kind of a, change in topic, a departure from talking about, really old stuff to, kind of contemporary old stuff.
Well, that's true. Well, the link is really that Velikovsky was a comparative cosmologist. He did sort of the same thing in terms of his studies that I do with mine. And I'd had a long interest in this guy, and probably since my high school days, and had always wanted to write something about him and decided that this was a good time to take a break from the African and Egyptian studies and take a look at what Immanuel Velikovsky said.
So who is he?
Okay, this is a guy who was famous in his own right. His book came out in 1950, and he was a friend and colleague of Albert Einstein's. And he and Einstein worked together to try to form the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And Velikovsky was a psychiatrist. And he studied under Wilhelm Steckel, who was the famous student of Sigmund Freud. And so Velikovsky had credentials that he was already a recognized personage in the world before he ever wrote this book. And so that made him a little bit harder to ignore. But the book that he wrote in 1950, which is called Worlds in Collision, was intensely controversial. It was a bestseller from really before the first book hit the stands. It was a bestseller. And what made it so controversial is that you had a non-scientist proposing an astronomic theory, and the evidence that he was giving for it had nothing to do with mathematics or astronomy. It had to do with ancient texts and ancient myths and things that you could learn from ancient cultures. And he had been researching a book, a historical book that he wanted to write in the library at Columbia University, and it had come across an Egyptian text that described a period in Egypt that sounded a lot like the 10 plagues of Egypt in the Bible. And so that got him thinking, well, gee, maybe this stuff is based on fact. And he started actively researching it. And he realized that the kinds of destruction that were being described wouldn't have been localized to Egypt, that this would have been an event that involved the entire world. And so he started comparing what the Egyptians had to say with what the Mayans had to say and the Chinese and so forth, comparing all these different cultures. And he realized that they were all telling the same story, that around 1500 BC, it looked to him as if a giant comet had come very close to the Earth and wreaked a whole bunch of havoc on the Earth and caused the eruption of a big volcano called Thera in the Middle East, and that a lot of the effects that were being cited in the Bible as the 10 plagues were really associated with this eruption and with the comet. But then when he did a little more research, he realized that the name given to the comet was also a name also given to Venus later in time by all these different cultures. They called Venus by the same name as the comet. And so he started to realize that this implied that Venus had to be a fairly young planet, that Venus had started out as a comet and had sort of roamed through the solar system and wreaked havoc on a number of different planets, and then eventually settled down into the orbit that it's in and become the planet Venus. And that's basically the theory that he promotes in his book. And the astronomers were outraged and organized a boycott of his publisher. First they organized a letter-writing campaign. The head of Harvard University's astronomy program organized a letter-writing campaign to get Macmillan and Company not to publish the book, and then eventually organized a boycott of the textbook of Division of Macmillan to put economic pressure on them to get them to withdraw the book. But Macmillan took the unusual step of transferring its rights to this best-selling book to one of their competitors who didn't have a textbook division, and sort of sidestepped the whole boycott thing. And Immanuel Velikovsky's book became a bestseller.
I think it's interesting that the scientific community, as opposed to just going, this guy's a hack, and just letting them publish it and then totally ignoring it so it could just disappear, that they would bring it so much to the forefront and fight. I mean, the guy, wasn't a scientist, and they could just say, well, he was a quack job, or he channeled the information, or whatever.
Well, they could have said that, but Velikovsky had enough credentials on his side that they really couldn't cast him that way. But also there were other reasons why they couldn't ignore him. I mean, he was really a threat to some major things in science. It looked to the scientists like Velikovsky was trying to resurrect the fire and brimstone religion of the old days, that scientists had worked so hard to overcome since Darwin wrote in the middle of the 19th century. And so that was one thing. Another thing is that the things that Velikovsky was saying fly so completely in the face of what was conventional as astronomic theory in 1950 that there were reputations at stake and there were theories at stake, and this guy was a threat to all of that. Plus, his association with Einstein lent him some credibility that made him hard to just ignore and say, oh, don't listen to this guy. Then the next problem was that over the course of the years following the publication of the book, the next couple of years, certain key aspects of Velikovsky's theory started to show themselves to be true.
Well, let's come back to that topic, because that's, I think, a whole segment just right there. What they found.
That's true.
What I find is interesting, because you're talking about that he was friends of Einstein. Is there any knowledge or understanding whether Einstein agreed, disagreed, was neutral to what Velikovsky had to say?
Yes, Einstein at first, he sort of deferred acting on anything that Velikovsky asked him about. They were friendly and they talked, and he, in private conversation, he was supportive of Velikovsky, but in public, Einstein was not subscribing to any of this until one of the things that Velikovsky claimed was that electromagnetism plays a role in the solar system that hadn't been recognized, and Velikovsky was claiming that if they looked at Jupiter and did the right kind of examination of Jupiter, they discovered that it was emitting radio noises. And Einstein said that that was nonsense, that couldn't possibly be. And 2 years later, a couple of astronomers who were studying something else accidentally turned up the fact that Jupiter emits radio noises. And at that point, Einstein was publicly embarrassed and had to step up and say, well, look, he apologized for not having helped Velikovsky before, and instructed his secretary to authorize whatever kinds of tests Velikovsky might want to have conducted in Einstein's name. Unfortunately, about a month later, Einstein died of a brain aneurysm. The rumor is that Worlds in Collision was the book open on Einstein's desk the night he died.
Well, that's a pretty juicy rumor.
Yeah, and so there's all sorts of debate as to how much Einstein really signed on to what Velikovsky had to say, but it's pretty clear that at least in terms of this one aspect, Einstein realized that he'd been wrong and reversed himself.
Yeah, because there are a lot of books that are, well, never mind. You've answered that question. It just boggles my mind that, even though he was a known force, that his book just didn't go, kind of by the wayside. It's like a bad, Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. It just kind of goes by the wayside where people just don't talk about it, and
right.
They don't really refer to it, and they just ignore it.
Well, they probably could have also. There was a summarization of the book that was run by Harper's Magazine that got a lot of play. It was included, I think, as part of the Sunday supplement to the Sunday newspaper. Mm-hmm. And so everybody saw this thing, and there was a lot of excitement, especially among college students and things, that, hey, this is a whole new way of looking at things, that planets might not all be billions of years old, and some of them might be younger than that. And so there was this upsurge of enthusiasm from the public, and that was hard for the astronomers to ignore.
When the book released, what was going on in the 50s as far as media? Were the UFO movies just coming out, and that whole age of science fiction, was that just coming to the forefront as well?
They were just sort of coming into that. A lot of the classic science fiction movies and books were written in the mid-50s and the late 50s. And, you hadn't had, the incident at Roswell yet. And there had been some talk in the late 1940s about UFOs. But mostly, in 1950, your average scientist was saying that Venus was a planet that must be very much like the Earth, and we could probably go colonize it. And everything Velikovsky was saying was just completely counter that. Velikovsky said, look, if this is a new planet, it's got to be really hot. And when our probes actually got to Venus, we discovered that the surface of Venus is hot enough to melt lead. So there are lots of things that Velikovsky said at first that when they looked at it in terms of 1950 science, they said this is flat nonsense. It can't be true. It goes completely against what we think. But over time, as we were now like 60 years past when it was published, over time, hardly a week goes by that there's not some new scientific article written that supports some element of what Velikovsky had to say. And yet, the scientists still really won't speak his name. They won't, if they have to make an announcement that sounds like it supports Velikovsky, they always accompany that announcement with the proposal of some new theory that sort of distances it from what Velikovsky had to say. Like they found what's called a radical called hydroxyl in the atmosphere of Venus recently. And when they announced it, they said that hydroxyl is a molecule that's sometimes found around comets, but that the method of production is thought to be completely different on a planet from a comet. And so they made the announcement, but they distanced it as much as they could from him. When the truth of the matter is that hydroxyl is the most common radical found in the atmosphere of a comet. It's not just occasionally found around comets. It's pretty much what makes up the atmosphere of the comet.
And Velikovsky said that would be found as part of. Oh no, because he said it was a comet, and that supports the whole idea that it was a comet.
Right.
But it seems like Venus is kind of big to be. I mean, are there comets that are that big?
Actually, there were announcements last year. They have discovered a planet-sized comet in one of these exosolar systems, one of the solar systems that's far distant from ours. They found a planet that has a comet's tail, and they've documented and they proved that it could happen. But then not only that, recently there's a probe that went to Venus called the Venus Express probe. It was the European Space Agency's probe, and it discovered that Venus actually has the remnant of a comet's tail. They were this probe was doing orbits of Venus, and as every time it went by, it would do a count of the number of particles of oxygen and so forth that it found in the atmosphere, and every time it would go around, the count would change, and they couldn't figure out why. These ions were. At first, they realized that these ions were being moved to the night side of the planet. That when they looked at the daytime side of the planet, the ions were being moved to the night side. And then they discovered they were not just being moved to the night side; they were being blown off into space. And when it comes down to the bottom line on it, this is a tail that resembles a comet's tail. It points away from the sun just like a comet's tail, and it gets stronger as you get closer to the sun. And it's produced, or thought to be produced, by the same mechanism that produces a comet's tail. So, in pretty much every way, it's the planetary equivalent of a comet tail.
Is this comet tail still being produced, or is it the remnant because now it's not an active comet anymore?
Well, it's still being produced to the extent that when Venus comes at its closest point in its orbit to the Earth, this tail points directly to the Earth and extends out in space as far as the Earth. So it really is a tail. You just can't see it. It's not a visible tail right now. But you have all these ancient cultures who in their writings said they saw a comet's tail on Venus. And so it's hard to believe that they would have reported that if they couldn't have seen it back then.
No. I mean, I think that, the ancient people knew a whole lot more than we do now. But you also believe that, too.
I believe that, too, that they do a lot more than we give them credit for.
So you talked about a little bit about the mythology. What other kinds of stories, or artifacts come from the mythology that support this theory that Venus at one point in time was a comet and not a planet?
Okay. Well, first you have all the stories from various regions of the world that all come from the same time periods that talk about Venus and that use words that are normally reserved for comets, or they compare other astronomical events to Venus using terms that are reserved for comets. But then you've got actual astronomic records from ancient times, like there are records in Korea that have been synchronized to the records in China so that we know that they're both talking about the same event on the same day. And again, you have Venus being described in terms that pertain to a comet by two different cultures on the same day talking about the same event. So clearly something was going on with Venus that doesn't normally happen with a planet. And if it wasn't a comet, it looked like a comet from the ground. All these ancient cultures, used to classify Venus alongside the moon and the sun because it was so bright. They said they could see it move across the sky during the daytime. And the same cultures only had a four-planet system that didn't involve Venus. And it wasn't until much later that Venus got added. They realized that Venus was a planet, and they added it to the list of planets. Then you've got ancient Venus tables, because back about 1500 BC, for some reason, all these cultures became obsessed with tracking Venus. As a matter of fact, the earliest form of writing in China was invented so they could track Venus. And what they would do is they would count. Venus has periods of time when you can see it and periods of time when you can't. And so when it would disappear below the horizon, they'd count the number of days it would take before it would rise again and they could see it. And they made very careful records of the tracking of Venus's motions. Now, if Venus has always been the planet that it is right now on a regular orbit that has never changed, those sightings should match our sightings today. But the problem is that out of all the tables that were kept by all the different cultures, not one of them matches what our tables today say.
But they match each other fairly closely.
Yeah, some do. There were several different methods they were using to track it. But then you have records that were kept by Ptolemy back in the 1st century AD. He's the Greek astronomer. And records by Copernicus that were kept around 1500 AD. Now, they both tracked the rising and the settings of Venus, and they also drew pictures of Venus has phases like the moon has, so it has different size crescent shapes that you can see. And the way those crescent shapes look can vary depending on whether the object you're looking at is slightly below your frame of reference or slightly above it. So both Ptolemy and Copernicus did these drawings and kept these records. Their records and their drawings don't agree with us, and they also don't agree with each other, which to my way of thinking is pretty good evidence that the orbit of Venus was changing between Ptolemy's time and Copernicus' time.
Does Copernicus's records match us, or are they still different?
No, they still don't match us.
That's kind of interesting because, we think of Copernicus, Mr. Astronomy.
They both are, really. As a matter of fact, in both cases, the only thing they got wrong in their astronomic sightings is Venus. And they both got it wrong. And they both got it wrong, in similar ways.
All right, but I'm sitting here putting my little brain cap on going, okay, Copernicus, Renaissance. So, let's say from the 15th century when he was living and working, we're talking 500 years. That's not even, that's current telescopes. We know kind of what's going on in time.
That's right. So that would all suggest that Venus has only really settled down into the mode that it's in right now very, very recently.
When, you maybe can answer this, when they compare the different charts of the cycle, do they see a progression of, and I don't really know what the gate is or the range is, the cycle's getting smaller or the ellipse time getting small, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So is there a consistent rate of
Really,
change?
I'm not sure how they would really judge that, but what I can say is that it's pretty clear that it's been changing.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you could say that it's not is if you just throw out the records that were kept by the people who disagree with us, and that's pretty much what the academics have done. They've made up excuses and reasons why, they must have had a ritual reason for changing this number, and they must have somebody must have mistranscribed this, from one generation to the next generation, and they made mistakes that got carried forward and so forth. But in a lot of cases, like in one case in particular, they kept two sets of records, and both records are wrong. And so you wouldn't expect that scribes would have made the same mistake in both sets of records.
Something that it just came to my mind, in the Mayan calendar, they talk about the 260-day cycle being the cycle of the Venus cycle. But then when they start comparing the 260 days with the Venus cycle, it doesn't really work. And it's like, well, if you add 8 days and then divide it by 4 and multiply it by 3, see, it's the Venus
Stand
cycle.
on your head and hop on one foot.
Yeah, pretty much. But it would make sense that they would come up with this number if the cycle was on a different day and not add 8, spin around, spit, and do all of these gyrations to make it fit into the current Venus cycle.
That's right. So, so there's lots of different evidence to cite. What I've tried to do in my book is I've taken Velikovsky's scenario. He says that based on ancient myth, Venus was ejected from Jupiter. There's an old Greek myth that talks about a goddess being born from the head of Jupiter. And this happened right after another body apparently hit Jupiter and sank to the core and vaporized the core of Jupiter is what the best guess I can come up with is. There's a scientific model, a computer model that was developed in 2011 by a Chinese scientist trying to explain why the core of Jupiter is half the size that it should be according to theory and twice as hot as it should be according to theory. And he concluded that, well, if a body 10 times the size of the Earth had smashed into Jupiter, that could have caused it, and that would be an event that was strong enough to have theoretically ejected Venus from Jupiter.
That's pretty intense. But wouldn't Jupiter's gravitational pull keep it from moving on?
It might or it might not. The official theory about how our moon was formed is that some body smashed into the Earth and created the moon. And the moon, when it was formed, didn't have enough momentum to be able to escape the Earth's gravity, but ended up in orbit. But that if it had just a little bit more energy, it could have moved out of our gravitational range and then started wandering the solar system. So if you had an event that had the right level of energy, theoretically, this could have happened.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm trying to figure out how. I've had this question in my head for a little bit, and I'm like trying to figure out how to express it. If Venus was going through a observable number of days through an elliptic, it doesn't sound like it went that far away from where it is now. I mean, not like Halley's Comet, that it's on a 72-year cycle, or some other comet that would be on an extended cycle. It sounds like it was on a very short cycle and actually orbited inside our solar system.
Right. Well, there are two types of comets. One are called long-period comets that come from outside the solar system and orbit around our star, our sun, and then orbit all the way back out, outside the solar system. But then there are also something called short-period comets. The thing about the short-period comets is that their orbits end up taking them near Jupiter almost all the time. And so Velikovsky was saying, but gee, it looks to me as if maybe they weren't captured by Jupiter, but maybe they originated there. And so they've done some recent comet studies that kind of uphold that, because what they discovered, they actually took samples of the component structure of a comet and analyzed it and realized that the comet was made up of what they describe as a real zoo of materials that had to form under really widely varying conditions. And if the theory is that they formed at in the early days of the solar system, some of the materials had to have formed very close to the sun, and some of the materials had to form very, very far away from the sun. And so they're scratching their heads trying to figure out, now, how did the materials close to the sun get connected with the materials far away from the sun, mixed together, and formed into a body? And they can't explain that. But if you go to Jupiter, most scientists consider Jupiter to be like a pristine sample of the original material that was in the solar system. And as you go down through the descending layers of the atmosphere in Jupiter and you get more and more pressure, you have temperature changes and you have pressure changes, and you get a whole range of different kinds of materials that form right in the context of Jupiter. And then you also have these big swirling storms on Jupiter that are capable of mixing the stuff together, that reach all the way down to the core of the planet and draw material all the way up to the top of the atmosphere. And if you imagine that a body struck Jupiter and forced a bunch of material out through one of these swirling storms, that you have the capability of mixing all those materials together and forming a body. And that, to me, sounds like a much more coherent theory than trying to explain how these diverse materials got made their way all the way across the solar system and got put together.
Don't you just gotta love scientists? Okay, so if they're in a short orbit, then, and this comet, I don't want to say planet, this comet is so big, you would think it would be a very obvious feature of the sky, not just in fairly recent times, but going back. Let me ask a different question. So when do they think this happened? I think that's probably a better question to start with. When do they think this cosmic collision happened?
Okay. The thing that we can date from is Velikovsky says that Venus did two significant things. I mean, it was moving around the solar system apparently like a comet on a sort of a regular basis. And that around 1500 BC, he says it came very close to the Earth, close enough to cause earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and so forth. And 1500 BC happens to be a period, one of the periods of greatest volcanic eruptive activity in the whole geological history of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And that is a major eruption of this volcano called Thera that is the largest eruption on record that ever happened, and no one's quite sure what caused so much magma to be drawn up into it and ejected. But the close approach of an astronomical body could do that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, now this eruption caused the end of the Minoan Empire, which was a great empire back in the day, and it also caused the end of what's called the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. Now you also have, at that same moment in geological history, you've got a huge fluctuation of the magnetic field of the Earth that they can't explain. They don't know why it happened. But again, the close approach of an astronomical body could cause that sort of thing to happen. And so we know, based on the timing of when that eruption happened, that was around 15 or 1600 BC. You have a couple of different dates given because in Velikovsky's day they had a different historical estimated time frame than they have right now. They revised some of the dates. And so Velikovsky says 1500 BC, but the traditional timeline now says 1600 BC. So it depends on which context you're talking in, what the date is. But it's the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. And so that's about 3,500 years ago. Now, presumably, Venus was born sometime prior to that, a few thousand years prior to that. If you go prior to 1500 BC, there are references to Venus, but they're all given in terms of comets. The icons they use to represent it look like comets, and the words they use to describe it look like comets. In the Greek language, the word Venus means the newcomer. So you have, in the languages of all these cultures, you've got other evidence that sort of supports the idea that Venus started out as a comet.
That's pretty interesting.
So,
it just kind of boggles my mind that it is just, I'm going to say, so recent in Earth history.
Right. It's within the historical memory of humanity. And actually, Velikovsky's toehold into this was, being a psychiatrist, he was interested in what he called global amnesia, or amnesia of humanity. That here we had such a major event apparently happened that none of the cultures remember anymore.
I know. See, that's the part that kind of boggles my mind. If they said it was 6,000 BC, even 4,000 BC and older, we don't have a whole lot. But, 1600 BC, we had writing. There was a lot more going on.
Well, one of the critics of Velikovsky said, well, gee, if that were true, why don't we see this topic discussed in ancient texts? And Velikovsky's answer to that is, that's pretty much the only topic we see discussed in ancient texts. You go to any ancient text, including the Bible, and there are huge portions of it devoted to discussions of, sometimes it's given in terms of names of gods instead of names of planets, but it's all this warfare going on between Mars and Jupiter and Venus and all these other planet names. Mm-hmm. So Velikovsky is saying it's not that we don't have references to it, it's just that nobody recognized the references for what they really are.
And you made a comment about Moses, so would this put that into that same time context of Moses and the slaves?
1500 or 1600 BC is the dating of, or the presumed dating of the exodus from Egypt of the Israelites. Moses led them out and parted the seas, and they were. There's talk about them having been able to see a pillar of smoke in the daytime and a pillar of fire at nighttime. Well, that's pretty much a classic description of what the smoke column of a huge volcano looks like. Mm-hmm. Okay, now a lot of the effects that they're attributing, like people getting sores on their skin, well, that sort of thing happened downwind from the eruption of Mount St. Helens a few years ago.
Really?
They talk about rivers looking like they turn to blood. Well, if you have highly iron-rich sediment coming out of the volcano that deposits itself in the rivers, it looks like they turn to blood. Now that causes, pretty much poisons the river and causes all the vermin who are in the river to get out. And so now you have a plague of vermin. And so Velikovsky was trying to tie the effects of the volcano and the effects of the comet to this list of calamities that happened in Egypt.
Well, and it would also fit very well, which is one of the plagues that I never could figure out how it could happen, the plague of the hail that burns like fire.
Right. And that also, Velikovsky says, would be an effect you would get if an astronomical body like a comet approached very close to the Earth. You might very well have little pieces of it coming down through the atmosphere like little meteorites and burning as they fell.
Mm-hmm. For that one, that's probably the best explanation I've heard.
Yes.
So it's interesting because last week I had Frank Joseph on, and we were talking about, he brought up about this comet, which I was kind of flabbergasted with the name, Comet Encke, except not E-N-K-I, but E-N-C-H-E.
Okay.
Are you familiar with that? And because it seems like there are some theorists that are saying, well, there was this planet Encke, and it, has a 300 and something. I don't know. I've tried looking it up, but the information was a little sparse, or else it was PDF files, and my eyes just didn't want to go there. But do you have any information, and could there be a parallel between the two, or do you think any comment?
I haven't studied that, but there's no reason to think that there might not be bodies out there that we don't know about, that are either too far out for us to have seen or that are not reflective so we can't really see them. And that, for a long time they didn't know that Pluto was there.
Yeah, but now it's not a planet.
Right,
so.
Now it's been demoted to, yes. But, so that, yes, it's within the realm of possibility that there could be something else out there that we don't know about. The space probes that they sent out, the Voyager probes they sent out to the edge of the solar system, ended up in a spot that they didn't predict they were going to end up at. They couldn't, based on their knowledge of gravity, they couldn't predict that these probes were going to end up in the place they ended up in. And so there's something going on with gravity that isn't accounted for by our theory. So if we're at that stage, they also discovered in the last couple of weeks that it looks like the rotation of Venus has slowed down 6 minutes in the last 16 years. And if that's true, then there are forces acting on Venus that nobody knows about. So our state of scientific knowledge is not really as highly refined as everybody would like to think it is. So when somebody asks me, is it possible that such and such, I have to say, well, I can't say for certain that it's not.
But isn't Venus the fastest rotating planet anyway?
No, it's actually very slow. It takes like 236 days or something for it to a day is 236 days long.
Oh.
So it's very slow. But what's interesting is that when it gets back around to its closest point where it's nearest the Earth, it always turns its same face to the Earth the way the moon does. And that can be the product of the result of two bodies having come close together before. It doesn't necessarily mean it could be just a coincidence, or there could be forces of gravity that are causing that to happen that we haven't accounted for. But it's consistent with the idea that Venus might have been close to us once.
Looking at the time. Ooh, need to move on to a new topic. So you talked about this a little bit, but what kind of reaction did Velikovsky get, when he released the books and, there was the scientific community, but what about everybody else?
Well, many of the college students embraced him, and he was a hero. He spoke at Princeton, and there were groups especially in Portland, Oregon, that formed a couple of magazines to actively promote his theories, and so he was sort of a hero to the college students. But he very quickly became persona non grata to the traditional scientists, and for years and years, in the late 50s and early 1960s, Velikovsky was never invited to speak anywhere, and he couldn't get an article published, and no one wanted to mention his name. Then when they landed Apollo astronauts on the moon in 1969, they brought him out of retirement, and the TV media wanted him as a commentator, and he made a list of predictions about what they would find when they got to the moon, and they've all turned out to be true. One of the predictions he made was they would discover water just under the surface of the moon. And even one of Velikovsky's best friends and supporters said to him, look, this time you're going to be wrong. They're not going to find water under the surface of the moon. And sure enough, last year or the year before, they found water just under the surface of the moon.
But makes you wonder if he had the psychic,
I don't think so, because most
remote
of the
viewing
things he
thing
said are just logical conclusions to be drawn from the scenario that he was putting forward. That if you apply just a little bit of intelligence to what the theory was, that you could make these conclusions, they would have to be true. If Venus is young, it has to be hot. And if Venus has been roaming around the solar system interacting with other planets, it's not going to have the same rotation as other planets, so it's going to be found to have an anomalous rotation. And just this long list of what he called prognostications that are really just the logical conclusion that someone would draw if they thought about it.
What I find interesting is that no one ever thought of those things. I mean, I can understand why, if you're a mainstream scientist, that you wouldn't necessarily publish it based on how the academic community is, and if you say something they don't like, bye-bye your career.
That's right.
But it just surprises me that a lot of them don't think it or look to prove it.
Some of them do. I have a friend whose name is Jeff Marcy. He's an astronomer with Berkeley in California, and he's been in charge of one of the searches for these planets outside our solar system. And he wrote an article last month that said that based on what they've seen in these other solar systems, he can flatly say that our theories of how planets form can't be right. They don't hold up when you look at these other solar systems. And so Velikovsky's idea that planets might be born because of impacts on a gas giant like Jupiter makes as much sense or more sense than the theories that Jeff Marcy says don't hold up.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of theories that get put out, and you read them, and if you're not laughing at that point, we do a lot of shows about ancient mysteries, as you know, and there's the ongoing joke of where's the ropes and the wooden rollers to just pull those pieces of the monuments around, which is just the most absurd theory that they keep promoting, which makes no sense.
I know. Well, and some of it really is just flatly nonsensical. Like one of Velikovsky's critics was Carl Sagan, and Carl Sagan had said to Velikovsky, look, when we get to Venus, we're going to discover that it's covered with craters just like every other astronomical body in our solar system, and the sheer number of craters is going to prove that it's got to be millions of years old.
So they find them?
Our probes actually got to Venus, they discovered that it was remarkably pristine. It only had a few craters. And Carl Sagan's answer to that was, well, clearly the entire surface has been globally resurfaced by some geological force we don't know about. And that's the official theory today, is that unknown forces globally resurfaced Venus, and that's why it looks younger than it should.
Yeah, it just moved out of the way.
Right. And so, I mean, from my standpoint, that's a magical solution. That's not science.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have to posit unknown forces as having caused the thing, that's not a theory.
Okay, so he puts this book out, and it wasn't particularly well received by the astronomical community.
Right.
Did it impact his psychology, business? You know,
no,
did
not
he
really.
get discredited
he
in that field?
He published all sorts of other very successful books, and so he ended up at Princeton the same as Einstein did. So he was on staff at Princeton. You can go to YouTube and find lectures that Velikovsky's given. My wife and I watched one recently. So he was, from a professional standpoint, he had a successful career. It's just that in the world of science, he was basically Voldemort. He was the man whose name nobody wanted to mention.
Did he ever venture out into other areas? I mean, there's his therapy part, there's this astronomical part. Did he ever go and venture into any other areas?
Yes, he wrote a book called Ages in Chaos. I mean, he really had this Worlds in Collision book was part of a series of books that he had planned to write. And Ages in Chaos really is conceptually a precursor to Worlds in Collision, and it talks about facts from geology and from the other sciences that pertain to the periods of time since the last ice age that don't make any sense in terms of traditional theories. For example, how old Niagara Falls must be. He was demonstrating, based on the rate that Niagara Falls is eroding, that it could only have been there since the end of the last ice age, and things like this. And that's the volume that really deals with the events that led up to the formation of Venus and so forth. He also did a psychological study, a sort of a quasi-historical psychological study called Oedipus and Akhenaten. And this is the book that he originally intended to write when he went to New York and got distracted with the Worlds and Collision stuff. And it's basically that he saw parallels between the Egyptian pharaoh, whose name was Akhenaten, and the Greek mythical hero Oedipus.
That must be an interesting read.
They're all very interesting. And even Velikovsky's critics say they really enjoy reading his books, that he's very convincing and very knowledgeable and very well researched and so forth. They just don't agree with his conclusions.
One of the things that I like about books like that is even if you don't necessarily agree with their conclusion, it does give you a different perspective that you can kind of add into the mix of whatever you're researching and go, well, could this be possible? I mean, even if it's not the right conclusion, it opens the door to the possibility that it maybe could have happened and gives you another area to look down because you might find a more appropriate, realistic conclusion.
Well, that's right. And it also points out to you that many of the things that you've always always taken to believe were carved in stone, facts carved in stone, that as you follow them down the rabbit hole and try to get down to the thing that the fact is based on, you realize that there's nothing there. And I've had 3 or 4 of those things happen just in terms of this one book. Velikovsky says around 750 BC, Venus at some point had impacted Mars, knocked Mars out of its orbit, and Mars started making its own passes on the solar system and eventually made some close passes on according to Velikovsky. And at 750 BC, it made a very close pass. And Velikovsky says it was close enough that it actually disrupted the motions of the Earth and extended our year from a 360-day year to a 365-day year.
Get out of town. Wait. I have been asking that question of so many people recently. It's like, you look at these old calendars and they're 360, but then all of a sudden they're 360 plus 5.
Right. And the traditional viewpoint is that the 360-day year was a ceremonial year related to religion, but it was just an estimate. It was never meant to be the exact year. So, as part of my book, one of the facts I was trying to pursue, because it could flatly disprove Velikovsky's claim, is there any evidence of a 365-day year prior to 750 BC? There should be. Can't someone find a text, show me a text, that says 365 days? Or what is the evidence it's based on? So I contacted my friend John Anthony West, the Egyptologist, and I know he has contacts who are experts in these things. And I said, could you please put out feelers to all your experts and ask them to explain to me what is the evidentiary basis upon which this 365-year claim day year is based. And it turns out that the only thing they could provide ends up being ambiguous, because in the Egyptian calendar they had a lunar calendar and a solar calendar, and both calendars had the same number of months and the same month names. And so everything's given in terms of a number of months and a number of days. But the traditional Egyptologist took the statements in terms of a 360-day year plus 5 days gives you 365. But if you look at the same statements in terms of the lunar month, it's 355 days plus 5 days gives you 360.
Okay, that doesn't work.
Yeah, it does.
Well, I mean, unless you add 8, spin around a couple of times, and do that whole thing. But
right. So as it turns out, there's nothing in evidence in Egypt or in China or in any other of these places that actually explicitly supports a 365-day year until 750 BC. But
see, I find that interesting, and I love that you brought that date to the table, because China, 360 plus 5, Egypt, 360 plus 5, or Mesoamerica, 360 plus 5, and I'm like, these guys are supposed to be these great astronomers.
Right. And
it
how
doesn't
could they
make
have gotten
sense.
that wrong?
Yeah.
Well, now you get just past 750 BC, and all these cultures all over the world that presumably didn't have contact with each other, all at the same moment, change over from a 360-day year to a 365-day year.
Well, 360 plus 5.
Well, they add the 5. They add the plus 5 at that point. Okay, so the question is, if this wasn't caused by an actual change in the length of the year, then what is it? What impulse is it that convinced all of them, so widespread from each other, to make the change at the same time?
Well, and they must have been a bad 5 days, because a lot of them, that 5-day period is always, associated with something not good.
Right.
Lots of praying.
Yes, well, if Mars had come close enough to do that, it would have been pretty nasty for anybody who was actually on the planet at the time.
I'd be praying.
So then you've also got a major fluctuation in the magnetic field at 750 BC. Well, I made a point on Facebook the other day. I said this claim about the change in the year length at 750 BC, nobody ever talks about the fact that this is entirely testable. Because if there had been a change in the motions of the Earth at that point, none of our computer calculations where we go back and calculate dates of eclipses and things would work beyond that boundary of 750 BC. They'd be wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out there are eclipses reported by reliable observers as having happened on a certain day in a certain city, and the computers can't confirm it. Now, I can't think of much way that could be true except if there had been a change in the motion of the Earth, because otherwise the Earth is like this gigantic clock that just keeps going, and you ought to be able to just add the numbers and get it.
Well, that just throws that December 21st, 2012 date out the window yet again.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
That was just a joke. I like talking about that date. But anyway, why do you think there has been, you talked about, the initial, issues in the astronomical community, and then a kind of a resurgence in the 60s of Velikovsky's work. Why do you think it has kind of come back to the surface?
Well, I'm sure 2012 has something to do with it. Pretty much anything that is outside of the box right now is popular. So that could very well have something to do with it. Also, we've recently had a number of space missions to Mars and to Venus and to Jupiter and studying comets. And every time there's one of these things, that's an opportunity for someone who knows about Velikovsky to say, hey, look, here's another fact that seems to support him. Now, one of the arguments that I make, in my book, what I try to do is I try to follow his scenario step by step. And at each stage of the scenario, ask the question whether the science seems to support him or not. Mm-hmm. Now, at every stage, what you end up with is a list of a half a dozen different considerations that could all be explained if Velikovsky's right. But if Velikovsky's not right, now you've got a half a dozen coincidences that make it look like he's right. And what kind of a scientific theory what kind of a scientific argument can support that many coincidences? At every stage of the game, you've got those coincidences. Mm-hmm. And so isn't it preferable to say, look, we have a cause here that explains away all these dozens of coincidences if we just explore it? And if we dismiss it, we have a handful of coincidences we don't know how to solve.
But that would be having them open their mind to the possibility of a different reality in a different scenario of how they would have to reprint books. And it seems like they really have issues about that.
No, actually, that won't be a problem very shortly. I think that there's already been a situation where a publisher modified everybody's Kindle copy of a book without their permission. So
wait, tell, come on, spill the beans.
Yeah, it happened. They changed a chapter in some book electronically for everybody who had the book without telling anybody. And this is the sort of world we're coming into where I even discovered this with my own book. A lot of my sources for my book came out of NASA websites and scientific websites, the same people who are so vehemently against Velikovsky. And I would find an article that had information in it that seemed to support Velikovsky, and I would track the link of the article online, and I would copy and paste it or download the article if I could and quote it in my book. Months later, my editor, my publisher, goes back to verify all these links, and she gets to the website and finds either that the website is gone, and not just the website, but half a dozen other copies that I knew also existed on other people's websites, or she finds the passage I quoted has been changed and no longer reads the way that I quoted it. And what I said to her, there's even a disclaimer in the front of the book to say this, that back in the day when you published books or published articles on printed paper, as soon as it hit print, it was fair game to quote it. And so I was taking the same attitude in terms of these websites, that I affirmed that they said what they said when I saw them. In many cases, I have copies that I can show that. Mm-hmm. And that simply because they came along and decided to revise it after the fact, and I know that NASA articles go through an extensive revision process before they even go up, so it's not like they were factually incorrect. Somebody changed it for some other reason. So we're in an electronic age where information is no longer, you can't count on it anymore.
Well, and it makes it so that it can just be controlled and manipulated so much more, but that's a whole other topic, and we're out of time. Your book, the Velikovsky Heresies, Worlds in Collision and Ancient Catastrophes Revised. If somebody wants to get a copy of it,
there are probably 10,000 websites right now that advertise it. You can find it at my publisher's website at www.innertraditions.com, or you can find it at any of the usual outlets that buy books from online, or it can be ordered through any bookstore. You'll probably find copies of Velikovsky Heresies in Barnes & Noble right now. Pretty much any of the usual outlets you can get it. You can get it in Kindle format, or you can get it in printed format. I prefer printed, but only because I like my information not to change.
See, that's why I just download all of my Kindle stuff, so I have a copy on my machine and not just relegate it to my Kindle. It's safer. And if somebody wants to contact you, what's the best way to do that?
Okay, let's see. I have a website that I set up when I wrote my first book called Hidden Meanings.
How come I don't have that, Laird? You need to email it to me.
Okay. That email address is hiddenmeanings@aol.com. They can contact me there. They can find me on Facebook. Those are probably. I have a Red Room page. If you Google Red Room and my name, you'll find a page that has contact information for me.
Okay. Good. Well, we're not friends yet, but you know what? We will be soon.
Sure. I don't talk to my friends as often as I talk to some of my friends as often as I talk to you. So, of course we will.
I was like, well, let me see if we're friends. It's like, oh, we are now.
Okay.
So that's all good. Any last words? We have not quite a minute left. Any last words you want to leave with the listeners?
Yeah, I would just say that, you need to be skeptical about what you hear, including about the things I say, and don't be afraid to go out and check it for yourself, because what you find is going to be worth looking for. That's pretty much the approach that I've taken, and things that I thought were carved in stone facts turn out really not to be that way.
In researching this material, did your view change from what you originally thought was going on to something different?
Yeah, my original plan was I wanted to turn up a single fact that would show definitively that Velikovsky either had to be right or had to be wrong. And we're sort of there with the comet's tail, but not completely there. We're closer than we were before. But I didn't come into it thinking that I was going to be supporting or refuting Velikovsky. I just wanted to do one or the other. And I came out feeling like there's all sorts of evidence to support him.
Cool. All right, well, I'm going to let you go, and I will talk to you again soon.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
All right. Bye, Laird.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And we're going to go to commercial break, and we will be back with Michael Joyer and Mark Mikowski after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.